What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Uncensored Critic podcast. Thank you so much for joining me again for another episode. I really appreciate you tuning in once again. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome onto the show one of the most prestigious directors that has had a tremendous career across the world, Mr. David Grindley. And it gives me so much pleasure to welcome him on the show today. David is a stage director and he has directed countless shows across the world. Some of the plays that he's directed across his vast and impressive CV include Othello, Pride and Prejudice, Black Comedy by Peter Shaffer, The Real Inspector Hound, A Midsummer Night's Dream, which went to the Stratford Shakespeare Festival in Canada. Jeffrey Bernard is on Well, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and of course, the big one, which we're going to talk about in a lot of detail today, which is Journey's End by R.C. Sherriff, which he's directed 3 times. One in 2004 at the Comedy Theatre at the Duke of York's and toured the UK twice. In 2007 on Broadway, which he won a Tony Award for the best director, for the best revival of a play. And in 2011 on tour at the Duke of York's, starring a certain James Norton, which I'm sure you'll see would have seen in Happy Valley on ITV recently. And so, David, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate you being here. How are you, sir?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. So to begin at the beginning, as Dylan Thomas says, so where did the love of directing for you start from? Where did it come from?
It came from my mum. My mum's Scottish and was I was born and spent the first 8 years of my life in Scotland. My dad who's English, worked for British Steel at the time, and he was an engineer at a very well-known steel mill called Ravenscraig, which is in a place called Motherwell, south of Glasgow. My mum had, from a very early age, been a member of the Paisley Players, which has got quite a good reputation in terms of out of the area. My mum grew up in Scotland, comes actors like Clancy, Kenneth Ireland, and even David Tennant is the son of the provost, or the essentially the priest in the local area my mum comes from. So that's where it came from, because when my mum we moved south to Sussex in 1978 because British Steel was going down this morning, and my dad saw that he was likely to be made redundant, so he unfortunately got a job in Sussex, in Brighton, in an engineering consultancy. And when she came to our village, that she still isn't today, in fact, where I grew up from the age of 8, she joined the local amateur dramatic society and got busy to work getting stuck in with as much as she could as possible. She did act, but she always preferred directing. And when her style of directing was, like, when she'd do a show, she would, I'm sure a lot of people know this, that Samuel French do publish play scripts, and at the back, and they're published play scripts of the prompt copy of the show. So they have the stage editions in that the original deputy stage manager put in the original script, and at the back of each Samuel French is a list of the props, lighting, and there's also a design. And invariably, my mother's amateur dramatics would copy this design precisely, and she would have blown up, not in the photographs back then, on a sort of Xerox machine, and she put it on an ink blotter on our dining room table, and she'd get my little Lego men, and she'd move people around the set to decide how she was going to direct them for the following rehearsal. And I'd come down as a kid, the age of 10, 14, and intimately through my childhood see her do this, and it just sort of fascinated me. And indeed, obviously, I always saw the finished works, and indeed everything the Village Drama Society did. And I was very much, looking at that, thinking, oh, I'd have done this or that. And then at school, I didn't do much up until I went to sixth form. And then at sixth form, I had the opportunity to direct a lot at school. And then at university, I went to the University of York in 1989 to 92, which actually was quite there's quite a cohort of people who went on and did stuff. There was me. I met my wife in a Sean Holmes play, who's director associate at the Globe at the moment, and was director of Hammersmith, Lyric Hammersmith. Simon Stevens was in the same college as me at York, so it's quite an active scene, and I did a lot of stuff there. I was the drama chairperson, director stuff, acting stuff. And at the end of that time, I took a show to Edinburgh. And then from that moment on, originally at the end of university, I was keen to be an actor. I actually auditioned for Bristol Old Vic and Robert Douglas, as was.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a complete disaster. I have a gap in my teeth, which, you know, I have a gap in my teeth, so I'm obviously a bit sibilant. The words missing from my teeth. But equally also, I do look like a bit like a cross between the old comedy actor Terry Thomas and Harry Hill. And so, you know, I was never really going to play the Dane. So as a result, I quickly shelved the idea of being an actor and found my passion as being a director. And fortunately, that, you know, I haven't really looked back. I've had a fantastic time.
That's great. I'm just curious to know what Simon Stevens like in person, because
he's great. I mean, he's the most lovely man, and
yeah.
he's he was a massive. We you know, being at university in the late '80s is kind of the height of the indie music scene. We'd all sort of grown up with the Smiths, a lot of the Manchester bands, you know, obviously Oasis, etc. And it was, you know, it was in the heart of the rave scene as well. And obviously Simon's a massive musical fan, and I vividly remember just his interest and just how kind of knowledgeable he was about that. And just every time, we didn't do much together, you know, passing across that much, but he's always been a sensational, friendly, really smart, very astute about most things. And every time you meet him, and I've, you know, met him subsequently after leaving university on a few occasions, he's always fantastically welcoming and brilliant to re-engage with.
Yeah, because I saw his play Sea Wall, their one-man show with Andrew Scott a few years ago, and it's one of the most beautiful pieces of writing I think I've ever seen or heard. And of course his play Pornography, which was based around the London 7/7 bombings. Yeah, he's just a vastly talented writer, and yeah, the fact that you just knew him at university, that's really cool.
Yeah, but he's incredibly human. I think the most important thing about Simon is he's incredibly human. He's got a real great depths of, you know, he's got a great sensibility for humanity. He really cares. He's got, you know, great emotional resource as well. So, you know, he really ticks all the boxes. You know, I'm very glad that I passed across. He's a great writer.
Well, please say hi to him for me next time you see him. I would love that. Cool. So let's jump into your vast involvement with Journey's End by R.C. Sherriff, and it's one of the most celebrated plays, I think, of the last century, but particularly not only because it's set in World War One, but just everything that it encompasses about the war in such, I think, from a human level as well. I think that's something that we're going to talk about. I've got a few questions about that. But just to kick off with, what was the first, how did you discover the play? Did someone give it to you? Did you pick it up in?
Yeah, my brother studied it at a school, and he said, and this is when we were kids, he said, you should look at this. This is good. I'm doing this. And in fact, when we actually started rehearsal, I used my brother's original text as a kind of touch point. My brother died in the early 90s. So it was just for me, coming to the play with that in mind, and with him being the sort of catalyst of my interest in it, was a you know, an added reason for me to be very emotionally committed to getting the play right when we did it. And then I was just very fortunate in the way that it came about, in that prior to Journey's End arriving, I made headway in the late 90s. I did a production. I was assistant director. The first big break in theatre was at Chichester Festival Theatre, where I was assistant director there between 96 and 98, working on numerous shows at toured and then went into the West End. And it was run by the well-known impresario and producer Duncan Weldon. He left in 97, and they were kind of, it was a very abrupt departure. It was essentially left for a cloud. And the new management were under a great deal, were running to catch up with themselves. They were behind in the scheduling of the season that year, in the 98 season. And so they were desperate to get people who'd been there before, knew the ropes, who could hit the ground running, etc. So they approached me to return. I didn't really want to go back as an assistant director, but I agreed to go back to assist if I could get a chance of directing in the Minerva Theatre, which is a smaller theatre down there. And we had no money. It was very much as back to what Sam Mendes did when he first arrived there in the late 80s, where he did shows in a tent using the as it were the smaller part, people who were playing small parts in the main house. He got them to do massive parts in essentially this marquee, and obviously, you know, from then the Minerva was born and became a physical theatre. But similarly, when it was all changed in '98, they had no money to program the theatre, and they were thinking, in fact, of it being a cinema, because in the off season it was a cinema during the winter. And we made the case, myself and my colleague Jacob Murray, that if he did that, if the management did convert it, keep it going as a cinema, it would kill the audience for the Minerva, and it'd be very difficult to get back. So we persuaded them to give us very little money to put on a season of work to complement the main house, to keep the Minerva open. And one of these shows, well, the show we started with, much to the management's anxiety, was looped by Jeff Walton. Wow. And we did it. The set literally cost 350 quid. It was, you know, it was begged, borrowed, and stolen for various places of Manchester. But luckily, it worked. It went really well, and managed to transfer to London as a filler, which means that a show came out early in the Vaudeville Theatre in the West End, and they offered us. We were just about to close. They offered us the slot to play before another show for 8 weeks, and we went. So that was my first moment, sort of where I was breaking through as a director in my own right. Then it was a bit, you know, as doing bits and pieces over the next 4 years to find my way and establish myself. My second big break came doing Abigail's Party. I did the first revival of Abigail's Party by Mike Lee in 2002 in London, which was 25 years since it was originally done. Back to the theatre where it was originally created, Hampstead Theatre, and the first time Mike had given the rights for it to be performed in London since the original in 1977. So it was a big deal, and luckily that came off. And with the success of Abigail's Party in 2002, I got a few people being in touch about, you know, doing projects and stuff. And one of them was this guy called Phil McIntyre, who I knew, who was a producer and a production manager, and a, you know, man of many hats, really. And he had produced Another Country by Julian Mitchell to great success, and he was wanting to bring it back. And he had but he couldn't bring it back on its own because he'd literally just done it, you know, 2 years earlier. I can't exactly remember the timing. So what he was wanting to do was he was going to do a season called Lost Generation, where he'd have Journey's End to start with, and then he'd bring in Another Country to sort of be a compare and contrast under that umbrella theme, as I say, of Lost Generation. And then for whatever reason, Another Country fell away, and it looks as if the whole project was going to fall apart. And then luckily, I was looking at the frontispiece of the Penguin and noticed the opening date of the original, which was January 21st, 1929. And I realized, this was sort of early 2003, and I realized that January 21st, obviously January 21st, 2004 would be the 75th anniversary to the night of the original opening of the show. And that was a hook. And I said to Phil, you've got to, you know, do it on this, get a theatre for that date for us to open, and so we can really play this anniversary card and make a real feature of it. Luckily, through hook by crook, he was able to do that, and more importantly, he was able to give me, although in retrospect it was you know, quite a difficult decision as a producer for him to take, he gave me complete license to cast the 2 leads, which were Stanhope and Rawley, with whoever I wanted, the brightest young talent in London. It wasn't at all, you know, in the UK, it wasn't about getting 2 stars to play those roles, because historically the issue with the play is those 2 roles are usually played by star actors who are too old for the roles, and therefore the reality of the authenticity of the piece of these 2 young men. Stanhope, the lead character who leads, the play is set in a trench, a company dugout in the just before Operation Michael in March 1918, which was the last great German offensive before the tide turns and the Allies moved towards victory. And it's basically set in this enclosed claustrophobic space underground around a table where Stanhope is the commanding officer, and he has his other cohort of other officers around him at various times. And Stanhope, we have to believe, prior to the First World War starting, has just left school. So believably, he has to be 21, in my view. Yeah. Similarly, the boy who arrives, who was a school friend, well, a school associate and friend of the family of Rawley, we have to believe he is 18. And of course, that's very difficult if you're trying to cast stars, because it's slightly different now, but you get Asa Bennett. That's indeed, obviously, he was in the film. But anyway, my point is, it would have put a real pressure if Phil had demanded that I have stars. And luckily, he didn't. And we did this amazing audition process which lasted months, actually. So when we got the comedy theatre, originally only for 8 weeks, which was basically just to take advantage of the anniversary and move on. We did this amazing audition process where we just over months met, I met Eddie Redmayne, Benedict Cumberbatch, wow. you name any actors of their generation, and I met them for the roles of either Stanhope or Rawley in that show. Andrew Scott, for example, as well, another guy. So it was just a brilliant opportunity, and I was very fortunate that we luckily cast exactly the right people, and Phil was very, there were certain producer elements to it. So around the two boys, there are older figures, and around the two boys, he was keen that I cast people who would have some sort of some sort of visibility, some sort of profile. And luckily, David Haig agreed to play Osborne, Paul Bradley agreed to play Trotter, Phil Cornwell played Mason, and we were able to, as I say, in that sort of parlance, we created a package that made the whole thing work.
Wow, wow, that's fantastic. I'm sorry, who played? You had David Haig, and who played?
We had David Haig as Osborne, who's the father figure in it.
Yeah,
who's the command. We had Paul Bradley play Trotter. We had Phil Cornwell play Mason, and I think yes, the other people were relatively unknown as well, if I remember rightly. Yeah,
nice. I mean, you must have met Eddie Redmayne and Benedict Cumberbatch before their careers just like skyrocketed at this point, or were they?
Yeah, but you knew. I mean, if I remember rightly, Eddie had just left Cambridge, but they were hot, and in fact, I knew Ben already, and I don't know him that well. I mean, we know each other to say hello to, but Ben, there'd been a lot of heat on Ben for years, because even when I was doing Abigail's Party, we were rehearsing in a place that was the most bizarre place in some sense. It was above a parade of shops in Camden, not Camden, just not too far away from Hampstead Theatre. And there's a bit we used to go to. There was a 2-story building. The rehearsal rooms on the second story, and at the top of the staircase, we went to the rehearsal room. You turned a right to our rehearsal room, and you turned a left to a Bikram yoga studio, which is obviously, you can imagine, absolutely baking. So no matter what weather it was outside, every time it was just this hot, fetid steam came out of this Bikram yoga studio. And Ben was in there training, because he was really unbelievably committed to making sure that he was going to be, that once opportunity knocked, he would take advantage of it, and indeed he did. So, fair play to him. He's an incredible talent.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan. I love the man dearly. He's very, very good. So in terms of the play, as you mentioned there, it's set in the trenches in northern France before the last German offensive, and before the Allies eventually did go on to victory. And I think we mentioned earlier about the first thing I saw, because I've watched the film as well with Asa Butterfield as well. I thought was very, very good. I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well. But one thing that really struck me was the as particularly with stand-up, he's been there for a very long time, so I think about 3 years, and you can see that the war has really had a change on him, and yet I think he's a very good example of someone who goes to the war, fresh out of school, and of course that's been projected in Raleigh as well. Someone 18 straight into the war, thinking, oh, that this is my honor, I'm going to fight for my country, and yet Stanhope, I think, is a representation of someone who's been through all that, and then he's got over the initial kind of honor of being there, and yet he's the reminder of someone who has been physically and emotionally affected by the war as a result of that. And you can see he's a really changed man, and in that, and yeah, I think is that a fair analogy, do you think?
Yeah, I think the key thing about the play, I mean, it's important to talk about R.C. Sherriff at this point. R.C. Sherriff was always destined to be an insurance agent like his dad. His dad, literally in his entire career, moved 10 foot from the corner by the door as an insurance clerk to by the window. And that was the entirety of his life. And he worked for, I think, the Royal Sun Alliance, and his son R.C. Sherriff was destined to follow in his footsteps, but he'd always been interested in writing, and in fact but essentially, I'll rephrase that. What happened was the war happened, and what happened next was that he joined the East Surrey Regiment, which was recruited out of Kingston Town Hall. And the most important thing to think about the play, because the play has come in for criticism about its officers, its elitists, it's the upper class, and the working class are patronized and marginalized within the show. My argument would be that R.C. Sherriff wasn't. R.C. Sherriff was lower middle class, I'd imagine. He was a grammar school boy. He went to Kingston Grammar. He had no. Yeah, he didn't have. He wasn't any. He was local as well. He lived in a place called Hampton Wick, just north of Kingston.
Yeah.
And he had no affiliation to the public school system at all. There's no question. I'm sure he rather eulogized it. He loved rowing. He was a big fan of rowing throughout his life. So yeah, he may have tipped his hat to the public school system, but the important thing about the war and the play is these were ordinary men off the street in extraordinary circumstances, all walks of life. And I think this thing about the play, as Sherriff said himself, was when he went to the war, he was not there for very long, because just before Passchendaele, he was walking a trench and an ordnance exploded near him, and he had fragments. He was fragged in the head. So, and the injury meant that he was unable to, after he returned to and recovered, he was unable to return to the front. And he had throughout his life, he had, and this is symptomatic of the play. This is why the play was written. He had great survivor's guilt, because a lot of the people he knew were killed, and the play is based on people he served with. He said himself that when he sat down at his desk to write it, the ghosts of his colleagues would walk in and speak their voices. All he had to do was transcribe it. And I think the key thing about stand-up is that, well, I think the important thing the trick in terms of my direction, in terms of the execution of the play, in terms of the trigger to get all the actors in the right place, was that my word for their behavior was displacement. Each character is displacing their fear. They're all terrified, and each character in different ways is displacing their fear by filling their mind with something other than fear. So in stand-up's case, it's work and alcohol. He's a ferociously hardworking. He's one of the reasons he's as on the edge as he is he's too good for the authorities to give him time off. He's such a great soldier and a great leader of his men, such a great example. You know, although obviously he is, you know, fraying around the edges, but in terms of actually when he's called to arms, called to execute his duties as an officer, he's tremendous. But obviously, the longer he is in the front without any respite, the more effective he's going to be, and the effect is that he can't help himself but become more and more addicted to alcohol. But the key thing about it is, yes, you're right. The other thing that Sherriff was very keen on is the notion of hero worship. That Rawley, yes, he wants to serve, but he primarily wants to serve with stand-up. He wants to. It's as if they're back in, you know, Eton, on the playing fields of Eton, where he's 2 years or 3 years below. Rawley looks up to this heroic figure in the first of stand-up, and he wants to pull on the shirt and run out to battle or onto the playing field with his hero. And that's the tragedy. That's what gives the whole play. It works on two levels. You've got the meta narrative, obviously the war there in the background. At any moment anybody leaves the stage, you think, will they come back because they could be blown to smithereens? But the personal is about the terrible tragedy that stand-up is appalled that Rawley's there for reasons that we can go into, and Rawley is distressed, is, you know, cannot believe, and is really broken apart by the fact that stand-up apparently has no wish from him to be there and serve with them at all, doesn't really want him to be around in his presence from one moment to the next. And that, as I say, drives the whole thing.
There's a really lovely moment, I think, in Act 2 between Stanhope and Hibbert, where Hibbert comes to him with a complaint about neuralgia.
Yes.
And and that whole scene. In fact, my first introduction to the play was actually seeing two of my classmates for A-level drama do a duologue for that.
Yes.
And that really stuck with me. Not only because of like they did a very good job of it, but the quality of the text and everything that was going on. For anyone who hasn't read it, it's a brilliant scene where Hibbert, I think he's throughout the play, he's, you know, as you said earlier, David, like everyone's driven by fear, you know, and I think Hibbert exudes his fear quite without saying a word, I think, in my opinion. But that scene, Hibbert comes to him trying to essentially say, I've got to go to the doctor. Hopefully they'll send me home and I can get away from all this. But Stanhope says, no, you're not going anywhere. You just have to see it out like the rest of us and I think he said, it's like, do the thing a decent man would do. Is the only thing a decent man would do. And over the course of the scene, Stanhope, sort of his layers of armor and hard exteriors, they fade away for just that brief moment. And he says brilliantly, slightly paraphrasing here, but he says brilliantly, we're all struggling with this. Every time I hear those noises out there in no man's land, every explosion, everything like that, it makes me feel sick. And everyone around here is exactly the same. So we have to fight this together rather than just trying to run away, because who else is going to do it? Who else is going to win this war? And I think for that moment, that really brings the fear out. I think that the fear is kind of subdued, I think, for a lot of the play, but then suddenly that moment happens and you see exactly like the core of, I would probably fair to say, every soldier that did indeed go through that conflict. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I forgot to say actually that Hibbert, the only character who can't displace his fear is Hibbert.
Yeah,
and that's why every time you see him, he's at various degrees of terrified.
Yeah,
and I think what you've touched on there, which is worth expanding upon, is although he never really thought of being a writer prior to prior to after the war, after he had his experiences, after he'd had this watershed moment, as it was in so many people's lives, he had a natural gift for not only language and rhythm, but dramatic structure. So, for example, what you just said there, the genius of that interaction between, and it's a short scene between Hibbert and Stanhope is, although it's a very short interaction, there's enormous amounts of turning points within the scene prior to the end, where the two part. The reason, in detail, what I mean by that is the beginning is, as you say, Hibbert comes in and he's summoned up the courage because he's obviously terrified of being called a captain, but his fear is so great that he cannot be quiet any longer. He's got to announce that he must leave, as you say. And of course, the first part, that's the confrontation. It's Sam saying, "No, you're not. You're not ill. You're making it up. It's all fake." And in order to call his bluff, Stanhope, also showing how unpredictable and non-conformist is, Stanhope pulls his gun, his service revolver, and threatens to blow Hibbert's brains out. And he counts down to the point it was going to do that. And Hibbert nails his courage to the post and manages to refuse to give in, such that Stanhope doesn't pull the trigger. He cannot believe that Hibbert has been brave enough, and would prefer to get shot in the head rather than to continue in the trenches. And that moment changes the whole complexion of the scene. As you say, Stanhope then becomes very understanding of Hibbert and wanting to connect with him and wanting to persuade him to stay. As you say, it's the right thing to do. And it's evocative because I think a lot of people, because it is only one set at one table, and the characters moving in, and it is quite wordy. A lot of people assume that it's rather static, but because he had such an instinctive sense of dramatic structure, that scene is a perfect example of how the audience are kept in a constant state of tension from almost the start of the play towards the very end. So yeah, it was a great example, and it was also very real. I mean, a lot of, interestingly enough, Sherriff himself said he was Hibbert when he was asked, "What character do you see you as?" He always did say Hibbert, because he would always be honest about the fact that he was petrified. And his writing, his letters home, which are still available to read, reflect that.
Yeah, and I think that moment as well. I mean, I think it's just, I think from an audience perspective, it's just a reminder of the horror of everything. And some of us, we look back now. The First World War was over 100 years ago, and everything, and we find it hard to get to terms with exactly what happened, because a lot of people who did fight that war sadly are no longer with us. But I think when you've got a genius like R.C. Sherriff and a play like that talking about this particular subject, I think that scene, amongst many in the play, just really encapsulate like the visceral and the sort of outcry. There's a real physical and visceral thing in that scene about how the war really, about just the effects, I think, of, if you want to know just a small sample of what that experience was all about, then that scene, or in fact this whole play, is a very good example of just what went on and what exactly was
what's going on now. I mean, I think we're fortunate, it's a wrong expression, but one of the reasons, not only was, if I do say so myself, not only was the production very good, but also culturally, when we revived the play in 2004, culturally it also landed at the right time as well, because of the Iraq War. There was this enormous connection between, there's this, the audience had a palpable sense of what it must be like through watching Jenny's End, of what it must be like for those involved in the conflict in Iraq to be what it must be like to be under fire. And indeed now, if you did the play now, the visceral sense of what it must be like to be in Ukraine. And I think the most important thing about conflict, well, particularly that type of conflict, the First World War, that heightens the tension of the whole thing, is that it's a mix, which obviously you can't read off the page, but it works so powerfully in performance, is the mix between deathly silence, where nothing's happening, to all out oblivion, and incredible gunfire and ordnance coming down, and this horror show of a soundscape as people are under a bombardment or under fire. And I think that particularly, which again he works so effortlessly in the play. There's one moment, for example, which you know about, where they do a raid, and we didn't do it exactly real time, but I was keen that the audience had a real sense of the time it would take for the raid to take place. So when two actors go off to do this, two of the characters go off to do the raid, and we just kept the stage empty, and the audience remained engaged because we told the journey of the raid, i.e. the characters going to the front line, throwing grenades, jumping into the Germans' trenches, having small arms fired, grabbing a German, dragging him back into the British trench, then being the sergeant major and other soldiers grabbing the German soldier to throw him down the trenches until they threw them down the stairs of the company dugouts, where the scene starts again. So my point is that all those actions I've just explained to you, we did in sound and light and smoke, with nobody on the stage, and yet the audience, because we told that story so well, and because the writing of the play was so good that it really gave us permission to really take a chance to see if that would work. The audience were at the edge of their seat, and there was nobody on stage. It was just, they could see what was happening in their mind's eye, and it was an incredibly evocative moment. And as you say, just symptomatic of so many moments of play that just so brilliantly dramatically constructed, and yet they don't really have the potency and the sort of the effect on your own sensibility unless you see them in the theatre, because they just don't. You just don't have the full sensation, all the effects working on you in the way that it does when you're obviously witnessing the production in the theatre.
Yeah, it's just, that must have been such a beautiful image, just the sound, and no actors on stage. I can sort of get a picture of it now, actually, just hearing the sounds and everything, and then they're coming back on and letting your mind and your imagination do the work. I mean, that's a skill, I think, that you've demonstrated there as a director in your shows, I think, to sort of keep the imagination rolling as well.
Well, I think it's a lot to do with I was very lucky with the colleagues I work with. So, Jonathan Fenton, the designer, I was very keen that the design. We went on a couple of field trips where we followed R.C. Sherriff's company throughout their time in France and Belgium. We went to one place which I've now near Arras. I've never forgotten. It's a Canadian. I've never forgotten what it's called. It's a Canadian monument and cemetery, and they have some trenches, trenches and tunnels still in play there. That the Canadian still curate this particular cemetery site. Anyway, there was a dugout in there that was incredibly small, and I said, Johnny, we've got to replicate this, and yet still obviously make it work in the theatre. So he did that. So the whole thing felt fairly claustrophobic. You as an audience felt you were in this really darkened claustrophobic space with the actors. You needed to. That was accentuated by the notion that you didn't have any sort of theatre light. Jason Taylor, the incredible lighting designer, gave you the impression the whole image was being lit by candlelit. So that was actually quite unnerving for the actors, because they came on stage with the tech and they didn't have any key light. They had nothing at the front. It was coming from below them or on the sides. So they couldn't. Usually, if you're on stage, as I'm sure you know, you can look to a key light, you know you're being lit. But the actors never had a sense of being lit because we were always lighting them from beyond, outside of their eye line. So he did a brilliant job on that. And then, as importantly, Greg Clark, who was the sound designer, just, so much of the story of the show was told in the story of the soundtrack that the sound design that Greg created, because it wasn't just generic gunfire. There was every moment had a life in sound of its own, that just accentuated just quite how terrifying and unnerving and real the whole experience was.
Yeah, and so that brings me on to sort of when you work with actors, and you mentioned there earlier about how to play the tension and how to play sort of the dynamic moments in the play, where you want to create something as visceral and as realistic as possible to do justice not only the text but to the historical event. So how do you what's the secret to playing tension, and what's the best way of achieving that? Well,
I think the key thing, I think the first thing, I've done a lot of my career has been, when I started, so I came to the fore with Othello in '93 at the Edinburgh Festival, and a lot of my early work was about being an event because you want to get noticed. But then once I found my feet, it became essentially it's about the words, it's about making a lot of my shows they just seem to be people talking and nothing else happens, and yet they're the most compelling conversations you've ever heard. And the way you do that is first and foremost, it depends on the writing. The writing has to sing. It has to be musical in terms of have the potential to hold the audience at the palm of the hand for the length that the production goes on for. Journey's End is an example of that. And so where I first started with is I look at the orchestration. I treat a piece of text like a musical score, and all the punctuation on the whole. I mean, it's just, I break my own rules, but the first instance, I look to attend to all the punctuation, the full stops, the commas, the hyphens, to investigate what that rhythm. This is something a negotiating actor. So obviously, you don't want the actors to feel held hostage by that you're dictating, as it were, the rhythm, the orchestration of what I'm doing, and I'm not free enough. You're holding me hostage. My argument would always be, I'm going to talk about make sure you play that full stop, but and make sure you play that comma, make sure you play that beat, and make sure you know the difference between a beat and a pause and a silence, because that's what the writer's written, and I think in this particular writing is good enough that I think it will give us something. But by the same token, I'm not saying that your interpretation that you as the actor, I'm not going to hold you hostage about your interpretation, just because I'm very keen that we investigate the notation that the music of what Sherriff's doing. I'm not saying that that's got to compromise your interpretation. For example, in musical scores, you can have different violinists playing the lead violin, and they could have different interpretations of that. They could similar different characters, and I think the proof is in the pudding on the number of recasts we had Journey's End. Particularly a character like Osborne, you had so many different actors play Osborne, and yet they were all different. David Haig, who has 5 kids, really felt like a father figure. Malcolm Sinclair, he looks as if he's come from the 1920s, really seemed to play the B of the period. Michael Siberry, who was a big rugby player, was it Michael Siberry? Yeah, Michael Siberry. Anyway, that's my point, is that there's a variety of interpretations possible. I was very keen that, as I say, we really investigated the orchestration of Sherriff's text, and then what happened was that the kind of the tension created itself. So, for example, Harold Pinter apparently afterwards, Harold Pinter commented that he really discovered his really understood the notion of the beat, the pause, the silence on witnessing Journey's End. And what I mean by that is that each of those are determined place and time. So when it was a beat, as obviously it would just be a bit short, but then a pause, it would need to be longer, and then a silence need to be very long. And it was in particularly the silences in the text that really make the difference in terms of if you're brave enough to just be to just allow the attention to build and allow nothing to be said, where you kind of almost risk people thinking, you know, characters have died, then that really played great dividends. And I think the minute we really discovered, as I say, the orchestration of or our way of orchestrating Sherriff's text, and really investigated, interrogated, and exploited the pauses, beats, and silences, that's the moment that the tension really sort of came to the fore and really began to take hold.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, do you think you'll step into Journey's End for a fourth time and bring it back to London?
Well, it's interesting. It's a life. It's been a life-defining, career-defining show, obviously, because, you know, we've done it more than 3 times actually. Because when we did it originally in 2004 to 2006 West End, we were accused of touring the West End because we played the comedy, we played the Playhouse, we played the Duke of York, we played the Ambassadors, and we had different cards for each in various, you know, formations. And I've absolutely loved it. And it's particularly it's a really it's a unique experience because you know it's real. You know the show is written by a veteran that's completely authentic, and the effect it has on the audience is unprecedented because they know that as well. And at the end, because obviously, you know, without, you know, spoiler alert, everybody dies at the end. And the way we did the end, we created our own ending because we had to, because we didn't have enough money to do the ending that the play was written as. And if I do say so myself, it's a moment of genius. And as a result of that, I feel even more attached to it that we, you know, the play's a thing. We didn't you know, we didn't improve Journey's End with the ending we created, but we made the play absolutely, the effect the play was having on everybody crystallize in a moment that just slayed the audience. And every time, from the first moment we opened the show, we were in previews for the show to the last moment we closed, and I've never been involved in a situation like that before, where you know, a particular way we ended the show had such a vivid effect, but equally also such a show where the audience, particularly in certain moments, were literally so wrung through at the end, and were so emotionally engaged and obviously broken by the experience and provoked. It was, you know, as I say, at the time of the Iraq War particularly, it really felt very live to people that our soldiers were fighting in foreign fields thousands of miles away in these sort of circumstances.
Well, I really would. If you ever decide to jump into it again, I will be there on the front row with the first night. No, I mean that. I'm not just saying that because you're here, David. Honestly, I'd love to. I haven't seen this play done yet, but I will. Hopefully, I will in the future.
Yeah,
so
it will make a return. It's too good not to.
Absolutely. So when it comes to your sort of the rehearsal period, like when you work with actors and stuff, not on Journey's End, but also in the other plays that you've done, what's your process in the rehearsal room? Do you kind of let the actors just do their own thing, then you sort of like correct them in certain places, or do you have a certain thing you want them to do? How do you like to sort of run?
Well, basically, it's become fairly methodical now. You know, because I've been doing it a long time, and I assisted a lot of people, and sort of I'd like to think I stole their best bits. The way it works is usually I've done a lot of commercial. You know, Journey's End was a commercial piece. We had limited amount of time, so I usually rehearse a 4-week period. And the first thing I'd say to the actors before we start is that we'll only be able to go through the nature of the time we have available to us before we go into this. We only have the opportunity to do this 3 times. and to go through the whole play 3 times. So the first time, obviously, we're going to work our way through, make sure we understand, that we understand who we are in the scenes. Start generating characters, start generating relationship, blah blah. That's obviously a book. The second time, you need to be just being aware, be sort of half on book, half off book, and then the third time, we need to be running through it off. And what I do is I break the play up into bite-sized chunks, and we just go through those. We go through those bite-sized chunks 3 times, but in very small. The bite-sized chunks will be individuated the first go through, so it's very small bits we do at a time, just to make sure everybody feels that we're spending enough time on every single moment, and they can feel they can leave having had the initial engagement with that moment, leave feeling satisfied that they know which path they're on, and that they feel they're going in the right direction. And then the second time, you'll probably put some of those bite-sized chunks together, you just expand the scenes a bit, and then there's the end of certain bits. The second time, you start running bits and pieces as well. And then the third time, you're working on acts, basically, or in Jenny's End's case, scenes, whole complete scenes, and then running those scenes, and then running the acts, and then doing run-throughs. I feel it's important to try and get as many run-throughs at the end.
Of course.
To really make sure the actors feel ownership of the play and what their role within it prior to the theatre. Because obviously, you go to theatre and then it's all taken apart again as you put the technical elements in place. And so you want to ensure that there's as much muscle memory as possible prior to leaving the rehearsal room, so that they can hit the floor running when all the technical elements are in place and running the show again. In terms of working with actors individually, I think the key thing is to be really open to what they're doing and who they are. So, for example, Jeff Stretfield, who played stand-up, who I've worked with twice, is just the most amazing actor. We wouldn't have. It wouldn't have been the show it was without him. And he's a good example of it. I'll give you a case in point in that Jeff comes to a show completely open to what he's going to discover in the text. He doesn't. I remember being intrigued that he didn't feel the need that, I say, oh, you go to, go to Belgium or whatever, or this, or that. He didn't. He wasn't. He would have been happy to if it was possible, but he wasn't driven to do that. What he was driven to do was just find the scenario, find the story, stand up for himself as he was working through it on the floor with the others, and in terms of his own work at home on the text. And what was brilliant about him is he moves and thinks he moves in rehearsal. So his consolidation of what he's doing happens very quickly in the rehearsal room. So and he's incredibly detailed. So what would happen was that we were able to engage in a way that we could get more. He was able to do more and more changes of thought in shorter and shorter time spans, or sections of text. And a classic example of this is another very famous scene where stand-up's drunk, and he's being put. It's at the end of Act 1. He's in a scene with Osborne, and he starts getting very distressed and agitated at the end of this scene. And at one stage, I was going to. He was going to run out. It all becomes very fractious between, or potentially it becomes quite unnerving between him and Osborne, because stand-up starts behaving very badly. Anyway, in this scene, there is a run of lines which are basically half phrases, 5 half phrases that stand-up has as he's sort of losing his thread a bit. He's becoming more, he's more on edge because of the drink. He's becoming much more antagonistic. He's becoming much more erratic in his behaviour. So you've got these 5 lines he had, which are essentially a half line, which is obviously over a 10-line period with including Osborne's instructions. And on each of these half lines that stand-up had, I believe was I told Jeff preview period were the crux of the play. If he was able to get all these 5 half lines, which I believed had a completely different, not just a slight subtle change of thought, but a completely different thought. If he got those, then I thought we'd have a hit in the head, because it would be utterly gripping. We would not be able to take our, we'd be enthralled by what was happening, because it was just so astonishing. Needless to say, incredibly difficult, because he was meant to be incredibly angry, then pleading, then sad. And, I can't remember the different, motivations, but they were all these 5 half were massively difficult, and he had like nanoseconds in order to make the switches. As we went through the previews, we had about 9 previews, I think. We come to me in the note session and go, well, how's that? And I go, well, you got 2, you're nearly there. And the genius of the sign of a great relationship between a director and actor is where a director is not giving up, interrogating an idea. I don't care if we have to drop an idea if it doesn't work, but if I haven't seen an idea work, I'm going to still push for it. But the great thing is where it's like a football coach, I suppose, where the player, the actor in this case, Jeff, was undaunted by that and was still pursuing, rather than giving up and going, he's being a tyrant. He's impossible, blah blah. I mean, at one stage he did think I was potentially asking me impossible. The point is that he kept on at it, and the show before we opened, the final rehearsal, the show before the final rehearsal, he hit all 5 of the notes I've just described.
Hey.
And he asked me next, and I said, that's it. And I said to them there, whether the critics like or loathe this production, this could not be any better. This is exactly any better than I envisaged. It's absolutely sensational, because, as I say, and because the idea is he hit those 5 notes and they worked. They really, it was just astonishing, the potency of watching this young mind go through all these various emotions in just in a heartbeat of a moment in time. And it was very distressing as an audience member to witness, and for him to take us there and be able to technically execute it was amazing. So my point is, a very extended, very laborious explanation, is the way I work with actors is to ensure that everyone who's working with me understands the collaboration, and that I will be very detailed. It starts, but that we just explore just gentle questioning, and then as the rehearsals progress, the questions I ask, the detail I suggest is possible within what they're doing becomes greater and greater, to the point at which the shading at the end of my production, when my best shows are up and running, is infinitesimal, because, as I say, the actors are literally doing something on every single thought they're having. But the key thing also is within that experience is to recognize that actors are different types of people, and you as a director to ensure you're enabling them to feel as if they are in the best place for them to flourish. So I've worked a lot with actors who are very, very smart and make great headway with the text very early, and they get it and they understand what you're doing. But in the same show, I've worked with another lead character who's less, less intellectually able to run ahead with the work they're doing, because they are incredibly, they have a natural instinct for the material, and that they're not quite as able to explain what they're doing. They just absorb what they're meant to be doing, and they just transform those observations into the delivery of the piece. Now that can be quite a difficult scenario. I was involved in a play where one lead, as I say, was racing ahead, having intellectually got to grips with what was required and was making progress. The other seemed to be slightly stalling. but I knew the key thing was to ensure that the person racing ahead understood that the other lead actor was a different type of animal, but that they could rely on me to ensure I got them, that they would be absolutely up to the mark and on toe to toe, and it's completely at the same level as the person who was racing ahead by the time that we got on stage. And luckily that's what happened. That the person who was more instinctively connected to the text and to the story, the character, was absolutely sensational on the floor in the end. So it's just personality management is absolutely crucial and something you're always learning about. Even now, I still find myself in a rehearsal room learning new things, how best to get the best out of the people you're working with to ensure that they can give the best possible account of themselves in the production when they hit the floor.
That was like a masterclass in the rehearsal room. How to run a rehearsal room. Wow, I'm yeah. Thank you for that. That was really great. No, I really appreciate everything you're saying there. I think I'm one of those actors that I go, as you said earlier, I go off impulse rather than, and I sort of let the scene sort of happen to me in the context. I like to absorb stuff, and then that goes through the movement, and then that transfers into the lines. And I think, yeah, God, that was like a masterclass in how to run a rehearsal room. That was just great.
It hasn't always happened like that. Let's be there. It's sometimes I've had some rocky rides, but on the whole, the best experience I've had is being able to create where there's only one thing at stake, the play that is the best. You're always trying to make a definitive production. There's no point in taking on a piece of work, particularly at the work level I've worked, if you're not trying to make the definitive production.
Yeah.
And as long as everybody's got that in mind, it's amazing what can be achieved. And I've been very fortunate in the various productions I've produced. But the key thing, really, I always say this to drama students I work with, is actually to be summed up in one word. It's a very difficult word to constantly, to be always in the moment with. And the key thing is to listen. If you listen and you're in the moment and you're just responding to what you're getting, then you're in the best possible place to make the story work as effectively as possible. But it's really difficult to do that because obviously your brain is wanting to comment on what you're doing, or is doing 100 other different things as well as listening. But the more you listen and do that simple act of responding to what you're getting, and then your partner or the other people in the space respond to what they're getting, it's amazing how that simple act can make such a difference from the very beginning.
Absolutely. That's amazing. I know time is against us, David. I know you've got to shoot off to do other things today, but do you have time for just 2 quick fire round questions?
Yes, of course.
Finish? Yeah. Thank you for that. I really enjoyed listening to you today. It's been a huge privilege for me. So thank you for sharing your vast knowledge.
No worries, Oliver. I'm glad you've enjoyed it.
No, I really did. Really did. So just 2 quick fire questions just to finish. First of all, can you describe for me that moment where you're at the Tonys in 2007 and Journey's End is announced as the winner, and you're there on stage with your Scottish trousers and and can you just, I know you didn't get a chance to speak, so I don't know if the Tonys were like you're pushed on time for accepting speeches in just in the States, but I think in general. But can you describe that moment where you heard Journey's End being announced as a winner at the Tonys?
It was amazing, but interesting enough, it was the opening night on Broadway that was the most amazing experience, because it sounds so ridiculous to say this, but actually at the Tonys, I was I would never have spoken, because the best revival Tony goes to the producer, and the producer spoke. And fair play, Bill Haber, who produced it, he lost quite a bit of money on that show, and
really?
he was he was wanting to say that war was wrong, and he got the opportunity at the tennis to say that, and fair play to him. I've got no worries that I didn't have to speak. Interesting enough, the thing that was on my mind was that with there's quite a fierce amount of underrigging wearing those shoes with braces and stuff, and a waistcoat. And the waistcoat wasn't fitted properly. You should never see the shirt under the waistcoat between the trousers and the trews and the waistcoat. So I was completely, despite being absolutely on cloud nine, for whatever reason, my brain was just going. It was just thinking to itself, "Oh, I'm not creative right. So I'm not wearing this disaster. I don't know, why didn't I sort myself out before I could possibly, before I had the opportunity to join on stage? Anyway, so that was what's going through my mind then. The opening I'll just briefly go on is the reason it's so brilliant because obviously it was make or break. It was a big deal with the States. It was from Broadway standards, getting to the States was by the seat of the pants. I couldn't cast anybody who was British who didn't live in New York or had the possibility of living in New York. I couldn't bring any of the original cast over because of that. And there's no idea how it would go with because obviously it's about a war that they didn't really have any connection with the same way as they would with Vietnam or Iraq, for example. But the first night party was at this restaurant, and the producer Bill Haber, when the reviews came out, because the reviews come out at midnight on the wires, and everybody, in New York, everybody gets to hear before they're actually published. He was taken into the side room to show the reviews, and when he came out, and the place was packed because they didn't want to spend too much money on the first night party because, again, there wasn't that much money to spend. They had no idea how successful the show was going to be. So the place was packed. He's in the side room. Everybody's looking at this door of the side room. He comes out, and like a gladiatorial arena, something like Gladiator. One of the guys puts up his thumb and puts his thumb up or down for hit or miss. And he puts up his thumb. There's a whole cheer, and then Hugh Dancy, who played stand up in that production, he stood on a chair and he read the review off a BlackBerry with the entire of the New York Times, because the New York Times is a review that really matters in New York. He read the review in the New York Times, standing on a chair with the rest of the cast around him and myself and the rest of our creative teams, and Magella Hurley, marvelous dialect coach, was there as well. And as he was reading it, everybody was taking photos, crowded around us, and it was just the most incredible. One of the most, apart from the birth of my kids, marrying my wife, one of the most incredible nights of my life. It was unbelievable. And so that's the memory that will really live with me because it was, there was no guarantees with that show on Broadway that it would get the reaction that it would, and for it to be quite so well received was just mind-boggling and incredibly humbling, and just so sensational to share with those guys that we did who deserved all the accolades they got, because they really did do an amazing job. So that's my answer to that. Sorry, Ollie, what's the last one?
No, just don't apologize. That was great. And I think, I'm not sure if you probably answered this question for me, but the last question was, what's been an experience or experiences you've had in your career that you'll never forget?
That's it. Well, there's a number of things. I'm being very fortunate. So most recently, I've worked at the Gate Theatre in Dublin, which is an amazing theatre set up in the and very well. And I did this play called the Gigli Concert by Tom Murphy, who in Ireland is revered in the same way that Brian Friel is, but his work doesn't really travel to the UK as well as Brian Friel, primarily because it's quite dark and it's quite provocative. It doesn't have the perceived charm that Friel's work does. It's a lot more. It's a harder experience for a UK audience, possibly. Although, and to be honest, I was given this play, the Gigli Concert, which is Gigli was a famous opera singer who sort of stepped into the shoes of Caruso, and it's a play again set in one room, three characters, and it's the play is basically a Irish developer, and this is sort of in the early 80s, comes to sort of English, is in set in Dublin, English sort of, you know, he's a medicine man. Really, he's you're not quite sure what he does. He's a cod psychologist is possibly the best thing, with a system that is meant to help people. Anyway, long story short is this play. I read it and I just didn't understand it. I found it confusing. It's just I couldn't see how it's going to work. I was invited to meet Tom in Dublin. I met him. He was an amazing guy, really fantastically, eloquent and friendly and human. But he was wary because, I didn't really know his work, and I was going to be coming to a prestigious Irish theatre to do what is perceived to be his, seminal piece of work. And then I worked with, we agreed to move forward, and then I worked with three amazing Irish actors. But as the Irish Times said, I was an Englishman doing an Irish classic by a revered Irish playwright in one of the, totemic Irish venues. What could how could it possibly work? And the great thing about that was that through close work with the actors, really close work, and paying attention to Tom, and really being brave enough to ask that, what other people would have considered dumb questions to Tom about absolutely everything that confused me about play. This amazing piece of work, and again, supported by an astonishing soundtrack by Greg Clark. So so the reason I go on about this detail is it is one of the most extraordinary. I've had many, Abigail's Party, as I say, at Hampstead, working, against all the odds, 25 years on. The Philanthropist at the Donmar, Loot originally when I did it in '98. What the Butler Saw, the American Plan, I did it at Theatre Royal Bath. And then, previously I'd done it on Broadway as well, Manhattan Theatre Club. All of these are amazing moments, but it really sort of came to a head with the Geely concert in 2015, because it really was against all odds. Because I didn't immediately have a sensibility of, and I could, as it were, hear the tune of the Geely concert to begin with, and B, I was putting myself in a very potentially dangerous situation, because I had all this. There was so much at stake for everybody involved, for this show to work again, because actually it's got a very particular ending. The show had never been put on, the Geely concert had never been put on where people thought could work, that was where the end had been completely resolved in the way that people thought it was meant to, and indeed that Tom Murphy, the writer, intended. And we did that. We made the ending. We made the whole thing work. And I think that is my greatest, one of my greatest memories, because against all odds, and against, not my best judgment, but against my real concerns that I'd be able to deliver this production, we had this most extraordinary experience. And the other thing was just getting to know Tom, who died a few years later. He died in 2018, because he was a real inspiration to me in terms of, he was so committed. He was so uncompromising about his work, his sensibility as a playwright, what he was intending to achieve with his writing, and he wouldn't be swayed by commercial aspects, or he was a purist, and he was enormously influential on me, and I was very glad to have not only met him, but had such an extraordinary time working with him. And so that kind of is the moment that in the light of everything I've done, that really stands out, because it really was, as I say, something that I didn't think would have the outcome that it did. It was extraordinary.
That was magnificent. And I think we're blessed him for those experiences, and everything, and just the gifts that he gave you as well, working on that show as well. It must have been tremendous. But wow, thank you, David. This has been so much fun, and so inspiring as well. Like you talking about the play, the rehearsal room, and everything, and just it's really helpful for actors like myself and my listeners, also fellow actors, about how do you work with directors? Like, what do you need in the rehearsal room? How can we just sort of make the most of this time and make the best show that we can? And you've given a really eloquent and really brilliant way of how actors can just explore themselves in the room and just know that the director is there for them, and how you can work together to create something special. And that's that's down to just not only just your talent, but also just everything that you've done over the course of your career. And I'm really lucky to have you on today, and I just want to thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on. And this has been one of my favorite episodes to do. And no, seriously. And again, I'm not just saying that because you're here. I've really, really enjoyed it. And thank you for your time. And please do RC Sherriff's Journey's End just one more time, please. I know you've done it a few times now, but sixth, seventh, eighth time, it's calling you back. I've got it here. It's like it's calling you back. It's calling
you. No, it's been a great. I mean, interestingly enough, RC Sherriff then went on to become the most successful until Richard Curtis arrived. He was Britain's most successful screenwriter.
Really?
And he went from a small house, as I say, in Hampton Wick, to a large mansion that he left to Esher County Council for the arts. He lived in a private road in Esher, and it was meant to be become an art centre essentially, but instead they sold it off into, I think it was 6 or 9 separate mansions. Then they then set up a trust in his name, which I still think does give art response, but it's not quite what he intended. But when they found themselves with this extraordinary house in their possession, they weren't really going to. They were going to commercialize that and monetize it rather than make it into what he wanted. But it's been an amazing experience, and I've been so glad to have done Journey's End, and I'm so glad to. I've been very fortunate to have numerous shows that as you said, worked incredibly well, and as I wouldn't have changed a moment of them. They all the gods were smiling in certain shows. That just the stars aligned to allow certain shows to really work and have the life they did.
Absolutely. Well, please keep going. Please keep going.
Cheers.
No, that's very good, man. Thank you.
No worries. All the best. Well, nice to meet you.
Yeah, and you. Well,
best of luck with the rest of the podcast. And when is this out? How do you?
It should go out by the end of today, if not first thing tomorrow. So I'll have some time just to look it over and then put some things together, put it out on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and stuff, and then we'll go from there. But if you just hang on, I'll say goodbye to you once more after I finish the recording. But I'll just I'll see this off now. But it'll be out soon. I'll send you links and everything to it, so you can feel free to share it around and do it with it as you please. And
thanks very much.
Yeah,
very well done on setting this up. Congratulations for your initiative.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much for your time. And guys, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. It's just audio only today. Thank you for listening, guys. I really appreciate it. I will be back soon. This has been the Uncensored Critic podcast. We'll be back. And once again, Mr. David Grindley, thank you, sir.
No worries. All the best. Cheers.